And I want to go back to your book and what you say about what tyranny in Rhodesia, tyranny in so many years of ZANU-PF rule, what that has done to our national psyche as a people, where our language is a language of insults, where the way we deal with each other is disrespect, where violence is everywhere. I hear you saying it's a false equivalence, but is there not something wrong with us as a people, David?
Well, that's the tragedy of war. You just have to look at the aftermath of the Vietnam War in America and the amount of money that America spends on its war vets because of post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I want to relate a story to you. When I was Minister of Education, I looked at how much money we were spending on different sectors regarding supplementary school fees. And I looked at the amount that we were paying towards war veterans. And I put forward a proposal to cut that back a bit so that we could fund some kids who weren't in school at all. And Joseph Chinatimba got wind of this, and they wanted to have a demonstration against me. They threatened a demonstration. And so I said, I want to meet with the war veterans and Joseph Chinatimba. And so Arthur Mutambaro, who was Deputy Prime Minister then, organized this meeting. He facilitated it. And it was a fascinating meeting. I write about it in my book. But the first 15 minutes comprised of Joseph Chinatimba haranguing me, recounting my past.
Typical Joseph Chinatimba.
As a Rhodesian Selous scout, which I never was. And I eventually had to say, Mr. Chinatimba, I'm Minister of Education now, and I've got a relationship with Robert Mugabe. He understands that I'm actually trying to act in the best interest, not of white children, but of black children who are out of school. And that's what's motivating me. And he eventually relaxed. And by the end of about an hour and a half meeting, we had a really good discussion, and we've had a good relationship ever since then. But it illustrates to me the problem that we face in our nation. Our generation, although you weren't involved in the war, I was, but you had to suffer racial discrimination. So our generation, black people suffered racial discrimination and oppression. White people suffered false notions of white superiority. And all of us had to suffer a war, which has affected our national psyche. It has given us a national dose of post-traumatic stress syndrome.
How do we deal with that, David? How do we get to normalcy? Because we are not a normal society.
Well, as you know, with any illness, the first step you have to take with an illness is recognizing it and not denying it. And I think that we need to recognize it in our country, that we are still afflicted by this.
All of us.
All of us. 40 years after independence, many people are still fighting the war in one way or another. And we need to start recognizing it and recognize that it has resulted in some of the crazy policies we've seen in the last 20 years.
And crazy behavior, David. Moving on to the January protests. I was shocked by two things. The level of violence from the military side, the loss of innocent lives. I was equally shocked by the violence from the protesters, the damage to private property, looting and that kind of stuff. And I stopped and said, who are we? What have we become?
Well, that's a very important point. And, using this opportunity, coming back to the issue of dialogue. What ZANU-PF and Emmerson Mnangagwa need to understand is that they've got a unique opportunity with the current MDC leadership, because actually we are the moderates. The sentiment out in the streets is a very angry sentiment. What we are trying to do is to say, let's stabilize the country, let's take us back to constitutionalism. The danger is that if that voice is ignored, that this very angry sentiment that we saw in January bubble up to the surface gets out of hand. Zimbabwe is rather like the bush in October. The bush is dry. It's like a tinderbox. And you might want to burn a firebreak using matches. and there's a strong wind that can take hundreds of thousands of hectares and burn them. And that's the danger that we are in our country at present. When you go into the high density suburbs, as I'm sure you do, and you speak to people, many people at the end of their tether. They don't know how they're going to survive until next week. And it takes responsible leadership right across the political divide to recognize that and to start genuine dialogue.
Do you think you have partners for dialogue within ZANU-PF? Are there moderates like you who are prepared to countenance what you're saying?
Well, I have friends I'm not going to name them and compromise them, but yes, I've got people who I interact with. What we need, I think, in many ways, this situation is analogous to South Africa in the early 1990s. Not that I'm not equating ZANU rule to apartheid, but I'm just saying that you've got two dominant political leaders, two dominant parties. And you've got two leaders that are finding it very difficult to interact with each other. And we need a Rolf Meyer and a Cyril Ramaphosa, someone one tier down, who are committed to constitutionalism, committed to respecting the rule of law, committed patriots, people who are passionate about the country, who can start that dialogue. And it may not just be two people, but to work out where the areas of common ground and how can we take the nation forward and avoid a conflagration.
I like the way you describe what our society is like in terms of what it to be easy like to with a matchstick to be irresponsible. In this kind of environment, how responsible is it to be calling out for street marches and protests and that kind of stuff, rather than pursuing as much as possible the issue of dialogue?
What you need to understand, and by you, Trevor, I'm going beyond to your audience, is, and you've seen it in social media in the last couple of months, Nelson Chamisa has been attacked. I have been attacked for being too moderate. There is a groundswell of political opinion coming up saying this is intolerable. We can't survive like this. And that same opinion is deeply skeptical of what ZANU-PF is doing. And ZANU needs to understand that when we call for things like this, and we've been very deliberate in this call, we've said it is a march. It's not going to the streets. It's on one day. We've indicated the route that we want to take. We're encouraging leaders to be there so that we want discipline. We want to cut down the prospect of agents provocateurs to come in.
How confident are you that it's going to go according to plan?
Well, I'm absolutely confident if the MDC is allowed to conduct a peaceful march. We've demonstrated before. In the run-up to the elections, there were thousands of people in the streets. You referred to November 2017. Zimbabweans naturally are peace-loving. The vast majority of Zimbabweans are peace-loving. And so I'm confident that if there are no agents provocateurs, if the state authorities allow the march to take place along the route designated, that there won't be violence. But the danger is that you have agents provocateurs coming from who knows where that can light that match.
Sure. But you also have the job seekers who has pronounced a number of times that his mandate, his mission is to get rid of Emmerson Mnangagwa even before 2023. I mean, those are worrying sentiments from somebody who's high up in the MDC leadership, honestly.
So first of all, he didn't say he wants to get rid of Emmerson Mnangagwa. The word he used was overthrow. And even if you look at the criminal code, you'll see that the crime is to overthrow unconstitutionally. One can be overthrown through constitutional means. In fact, ironically, that's what Mr. Mnangagwa would say about Robert Mugabe. They would say that was a perfectly constitutional end to his rule. Pressure was put on him and he resigned his position. That is an overthrow, but it's an overthrow through constitutional means. But let me get to the nub of your point about Job Sakhalin. I have no doubt that Job Sakhalin, when he talks about this, he talks about using constitutional, non-violent means.
But that doesn't come across, David.
It doesn't come across, but it does come across if you look in the wider context and you understand Sakhalin over the last 20 years, as I do. I've been in Parliament with him. But one needs to look beyond that. One needs to recognize that in some respects, Job Sakhalin is a lightning rod. He is reflecting a sentiment that is held at grassroots level. There are many people, not you and I. We have incomes and savings, and we're not affected by this, and we can drive around if we don't get bread at one shop. But there are desperate people there. And that's what ZANU, I think, needs to understand. Not to look so much at the messenger in Job Sakhalin, but understand that actually, in many respects,
he speaks on behalf of
he's speaking on behalf of others.
Okay. Let's move on to another contentious issue, which is Zidera, or the sanctions issue. Has seeing the real effect of Zidera on how banks operate, how companies operate in this country, that it is not targeted, that its effects are broad across all sectors of the economy. Have you changed your views on Zidera and sanctions?
I have not changed my views, because as far back as 2010, I was on Hard Talk, BBC Hard Talk, when I spoke vigorously against sanctions. And I've been consistently against sanctions since then. You can Google, you will see that I've consistently spoken against sanctions, because I believe that perhaps while they served their purpose in the early 2000s, they've outlived their purpose. But we have to deal with the reality. My voice has been disregarded by countries, my strong calls for sanctions to go. And so I'm not the best person for you to ask that question, because I haven't advocated sanctions.
I suppose when I was
time.
saying you, I was talking in terms of the party.
Yeah, but I don't think
yeah.
you'll see the party either has advocated for sanctions for a long time. But the critical thing, if you look at Zidera, is not so much to look at the sanctions, but to look at what measures need to be taken to remove those sanctions. And Zidera says very clearly, comply with the Constitution, and sanctions will be lifted. And even if we look at the recent imposition of this additional sanction against the general responsible for the chaos on the 1st of August, that sanction has been imposed on him because of a fundamental breach of the Constitution. So the key to the solution to sanctions actually lies with the government. If they implement the Constitution, I believe that sanctions would go in short order.
But you don't support the sanctions per se?
I don't support the sanctions, because I think they've outlived their usefulness, and I think in many respects they are used as an excuse by ZANU-PF. The real reason for the economic collapse in this country is because we've destroyed domestic business confidence, which has nothing to do with sanctions.
Let's move on now. MDC controls the majority of urban councils. Is it a fair thing to say, shouldn't MDC be doing lots to ensure that they can impress on the electorate by ensuring that those local government authorities are properly run, properly governed, to prove to the electorate that we can do this job? Shouldn't that be happening? Is there something that we're missing?
Well, I think that's fair comment. And in my run-up to my own personal election in the MDC, one of my mantras was that we cannot say to the electorate that we're capable of governing the country if we can't govern the party well and the institutions that the party controls. And there's no doubt in my mind that the MDC has not run the city councils as well as it could have, and we've got a lot of work to do. And the recent shenanigans in Bulawayo are very damaging to the party. We have to sort that out.
What's behind that?
Well, I think part of what is behind that is
the Bulawayo shenanigans.
I think it's complex. It's multifaceted. It's deeply rooted. It goes back to corruption that has brought about by the wider corruption in our society. There's an element of tribalism in there, and inevitably there's an element of personality. But coming back to the nub of your question, yes, the MDC has got a lot of work to do to improve delivery from councils. But you cannot look at the way councils is run. This is the balance to the answer.
Sure.
You can't look at them in isolation. You have to judge the way councils are run in the wider context of the country. And we know that ZANU-PF has routinely interfered with the operations of councils. In the run-up to some elections, you've had ministers of local government waiving rates, which has seriously undermined the balance sheet of city councils. So yes, the MDC is responsible, but it's not solely responsible. Government also bears the blame for why our councils have not run as well as they should have.
Let's move on to your economic program, which you've just launched now, Reload. What are the key highlights that you think would go some way in ameliorating some of the problems that the country faces right now?
Well, Reload isn't the economic policy. Reload is how we stabilize the country. That's
right.
The essence.
Thanks for the correction.
And the focus of Reload is what we've discussed in this interview. How do we get to dialogue? And we believe that to get to dialogue, we need genuine dialogue. We need an independent peer to mediate. We need respect for constitutionalism. We need a return to the rule of law. And we need to agree on the process that we will follow through to the next election. Looking at Zimbabwe from a completely objective, I hope, perspective, I will try to be as unbiased. Right. But if you look at the two main political protagonists in the country, the MDC and ZANU-PF, what the MDC needs in the run-up to the next election is constitutional compliance. We need food aid not to be a factor. We need all Zimbabweans to be registered. We need a genuinely independent electoral commission. We need the ZBC to be an impartial body. That's what the Constitution says. All of those are needs that the opposition, not just the MDC, all opposition parties need in the run-up to the election. On the other side of the spectrum is what ZANU-PF needs. ZANU-PF has the control. But if there isn't political stability, if there isn't economic stability in the run-up to the election, it's going to make its job of winning a free and fair election very difficult. And that's the quid pro quo. That's what we need, and that's what Reload talks about. Let's return the country to constitutionalism, respect the rule of law, and then the international community, we hope, will respond to that. Zadera can go, balance of payment support can come in, we can stabilize the economy, and we then move towards a new election with an entirely different political climate and economic climate to the one afflicting us today.
We are the nation is in the grips of crises. There's the energy crisis, there's fuel, shortage of goods and services and so forth. What view do you take of that in terms of what quick solutions would MDC be able to implement, wait you to come into
Well, there's
power?
no quick solution that as a businessman, that the problems are so deeply rooted. There's no silver bullet, no magic wand to restore.
Would you be able to tell that to MDC supporters, that there's no quick solution?
Well,
there's
I've
no
said
magic
it.
wand?
In the run-up to during the Congress weekend, I was interviewed, and that interview was published when I said just that. But let me answer the nub of your question. What the MDC would do is two things. Firstly, it has a better chance of restoring business confidence. And secondly, it would be prepared to completely liberalize, for example, access to foreign
unpack
exchange.
those two?
Sorry?
Unpack those two?
So on business confidence, what we saw Tendai Biti do was restore business confidence, primarily in the banking sector. And this is objectively ascertained. Bank deposits during his tenure dramatically increased because both businesses and people felt that they could trust putting their money into bank balances rather than under their pillows. That was reversed. Soon after the 2000 election, we saw a run on the banks. And unfortunately, it's an intangible concept.
Sentiment.
And sentiment. It's sentiment. It's a perception that the person in charge isn't going to rob your money. That applies to commercial banks. It applies to central banks. I was recently reading an article about the Federal Reserve in America, and they were talking that actually the most important element in the running of any central bank in the world comes down to one word: trust. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you have to restore trust. You cannot restore trust if you say one thing one day and do another thing the next. That applies to marriages, it applies to running banks. So trust is fundamental. Then secondly, you have to be prepared to release your vice-like grip on, for example, foreign exchange. You have to allow the market to determine how it wishes to spend foreign exchange. There's a third element, and that relates to corruption. Corruption is now endemic in our society, and it seems to be growing, if anything. You have to root it out deeply. And
this is corruption that we find in MDC-run city councils, corruption that's endemic all across our institutions.
Once again, I don't want us to verge into false equivalence. I don't think, I'm being candid with you today, that yes, we can see that there has been corruption in the running of some MDC councils, but you cannot equate that with the corruption that we've seen in the last few weeks revealed. $98 million, houses allegedly bought throughout. There's not a single councillor in Zimbabwe. They might have a house in Highlands that they've bought, but they don't have a house in Britain or Canada or Cape Town. It's a false equivalence. The deep-rooted corruption is what we see emerge in the last few weeks. But we have to root out all corruption. I come back to my profession of faith. A key element to the Christian faith is that all people have fallen short.
Sure.
And there's no such thing as a perfect politician. There's no such thing as a perfect political party. And anyone who says that they're perfect or their political party is perfect is simply not telling the truth. And so we need to have that national honesty to realize that, as with violence has now become a national disease, and corruption is a national disease. Those two diseases are affecting our country, and everyone has to work to eradicate them.
Let's move on to the state of MDC finances. Did you receive your check from Parliament? Did ZANU-PF receive their check? Are you broke?
Not at the time of this interview. I'm hoping perhaps at the end of this interview that we might have some good news. No, sadly the news is not good. We are told that ZANU-PF has received its money. I certainly, as Treasurer, have not received the money that we are entitled to. And it comes back to the dialogue process and the issue of genuineness and respect and trust. You've got to build trust.
In fairness, ZANU-PF is denying that they've received the money.
ZANU-PF are denying that they've received the money, but we are told I'm not going to compromise the permanent secretary involved, but we are told by a very senior civil servant that ZANU-PF have received their money. And what we know 100%, because our Secretary General called Minister Ziyambi and Minister Ncube together in Parliament a couple of days ago. And Minister Ncube confirmed to Secretary General Wendy that he had transferred the money to the Ministry of Justice. So it's sitting in the Ministry of Justice, and we have no reasonable explanation why it hasn't been dispersed to us yet.
Hopefully we'll get it after this interview. Let's get to something which is pretty serious that you've written about in your book extensively, Gukurawundi. Are you happy with the way the current government is dealing with this issue?
I think that there's progress. To be fair, you have to say that there's progress in that one couldn't speak about it at all during Mugabe's rule. And in fairness, people are now at least speaking about it. It comes back to genuineness. We need to see more of that from government. And unfortunately, it is going to take more action. When I and others, the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace and the Legal Resources Foundation, did the research for Breaking the Silence, which was published in 1997, we did 5 years of research. And we interviewed over 2,000 victims during that period. And it was very interesting for me what the common demands were of people. I was expecting as a lawyer that victims would say, right, we want justice, we want people prosecuted. That wasn't the dominant request. There were 3 requests. The first was an acknowledgement that what had happened from those responsible for it happening.
Right.
Secondly, they wanted an apology from those responsible for what had happened. And thirdly, they wanted communal reparations. You know that if you drive to Kezi or Chilocho in Kai or Rwanda, you travel on roads that are over 60 years old. They haven't changed since the 1950s. If you travel to Guruve or Bunjura or Chipinge, you will travel on roads that were constructed since independence. That is a hard developmental fact in our country. And the roads are really just the tip of the iceberg. If you go to clinics and schools, you will see, and I know this with some authority on schools, there are less schools that teach A-level chemistry and biology in the southwest of the country than there are elsewhere in the country. And during the first 10 years, during Gukurawundi, there was underdevelopment of those regions. And that's what people called for. They want affirmative action. It's no use turning around saying all rural areas are poor. We need affirmative action. It needs to be shown in dollars and cents and in the budget. And those are the 3 critical things that I think are going to heal. And at present, we haven't got any of those 3 demands. And these are not my demands. These were, in fact, they weren't even demands. They were the wishes, the requests of 2,000 victims.
David, what a fascinating conversation that you've had, and you've been very candid. And I want to ask you, David, to ask you this question, David. Are you optimistic about where this country is going? Are you hopeful? If you're not, what is it that would make you hopeful and optimistic about this country?
Trevor, you are a treasure.
Thank you.
But Trevor, I have a deep passion for this country. I love it to the depths of my bones. And because of that, I still retain this faith in our nation. I have a consistent mantra when I speak, not just here, but I was in London in June, and I said exactly this. I said, this is a country which should and can be the jewel of Africa. It has got every possible ingredient needed to become the best country in Africa, primarily because of our people. We have the least racist people in the world, in my personal experience. We have highly educated people. We have an incredible workforce, trustworthy, dedicated, hard-working people. And on top of that, we have this beautiful country, this amazing climate, amazing soils, amazing rains, this diverse resource base, this tourist base, our position in Central Africa, our infrastructure. We've got everything, but we're missing one ingredient, and it's democracy, constitutionalism. I believe that if we tackle our past, if we recognize the errors of our past, and we genuinely respect our constitution, respect the rule of law, rebuild a sense of patriotism in this country is going to boom, and in short order. So the short answer to your question is that I still, for all our problems today, have huge faith in this country and believe that it will yet become the jewel of Africa.
I thought that would be the last question, but I must ask you this. Is there anything that David would do to move the dialogue process beyond where it is right now?
Well, I'm already doing it. I'm speaking to my colleagues in the MDC. I was at a diplomatic function a few weeks ago, and there was someone very close to Mr. Mnangagwa there, and he knows what I said to him, that we have to move this forward. We cannot allow the suffering of our people to continue. But we need genuineness.
David, on that hopeful note, thank you so much for coming
Thanks,
on
Trevor,
to
for the
In
opportunity.
Conversation with Trevor. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Don't want to miss out on these insightful conversations? Subscribe to our YouTube channel.